Everyone. We're going to give folks just a few more minutes to join the webinar, and we will begin at 10 a.m.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Jarmon. I am your guest for today, so thank you for having me. Before we begin, make sure that you're able to hear me. So I hope that if you see some movement, that you can actually hear me talking, but also make sure that you can see the PowerPoint presentation that says how to develop a diverse board. If you cannot see that, if you don't mind putting a question in the question tab so we can make sure that we adjust that on our end. And it just lets me know who's on. So I'd love to see that. We'll give just a few moments for people to let me know if they can't see the PowerPoint. Okay, I don't see anybody, so that's helpful. I also want to make sure that you all know that, oh, okay, let's see, can't see it. Okay, all right, Mara and Carissa, hold on just a second, and we will work on that for you. Okay. How about now? Can you all see the screen? Not yet. Okay. I wonder.
Can you all see it now?
Waiting for the screen. Okay. Let's make sure. So hit show screen here. Let's. Okay, now we're sharing. Okay, so let's just double check. We just reshared with everyone. Let's make sure. Okay, thank you, Mark. Great. Mike, awesome. I'm glad you can see us. Okay, Tracy, thank you so much for checking in with us. Awesome. I think everyone can see it. If for some reason you can't see throughout, please let us know. Want to make sure that you all are aware also that we're recording this conversation so that you get an opportunity to play it back. I think information like this is best digested when you have a chance to really sit with it. So as I discussed, we're talking about how to develop a diverse board. And this topic is so timely. It's happening all across the country. I'm sure you know this because this is why you're having this particular conversation. And it's such a buzz topic. So my hope is that by the end of today, you have some tangible things that you can practically implement right there in your office. That's really always my goal when I am developing a session such as this. So let me tell you why this is such a buzz topic and how this comes up. Very often in my sessions and doing these workshops, people will come and say, Nakia, do you know an African American? Do you know a person who is gay? Do you know a person of faith? And I say, yes, I know all those people. Why are we talking about that in this conversation? And we often talk about recruiting board members versus developing relationships with individuals. And that's really the key here. So how to develop a diverse board, we're going to jump into that topic and really talk more about that so that that's not your question to me, but instead, how do I build relationships? So I want you all in that same question box or message box that you messaged me and told me you couldn't see it, press 1 if your board is 75% or more white or male. In some of your cases, it might be female and white, and that's okay. Put a 1 there for me. Press 2 if it's 75% of your board is 50 years or older. And press 3 if your board has been serving for more than 5 years. So you have individuals on your board who have served for 5 years or more. Or you can press 1, 2, and 3 if you happen to have all of those. And I'd love to see that feedback. I'll give you all just a moment to tap in with me. Okay, good. I'll wait on a couple more answers here. Very good. Thank you for sharing. Any other feedback? Hopefully you all see that question box there. And I know that some of you may still just be joining on, so you'll jump in at any time. Thanks for sharing that. So what I can see from some of those numbers is that we have some huge disparities in how we are able to really communicate and connect with our constituents, because that's ultimately what we're talking about here, is building relationship with the people who we serve, the core mission of our organizations. I'm also seeing, I see a couple that talk about serving more than 5 years. We know that when we have kind of lax term limits or very long-term limits or continuation or people being able to recur on the board within that way, that we sometimes lose that fresh perspective and an opportunity. And so I give it to you like this, the way that I shared with the international group a few years ago. When you have board members who are challenging to you, and so meaning they have never learned how to be good board members, then they continue that and they recruit other board members who are not so great for your organization. So then you end up with this perpetual cycle of sometimes an unfortunate event of having individuals who are just not willing to even entertain a diverse community of people. So let's keep pushing forward so you know a little bit more about who I am and why I'm talking about this subject. If for some reason you love something I say, tag me, tweet me, quote me. I'd love for you, I'm on all the social networks, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. I'd love for you to share any of those things that you hear today that might be helpful to you. But who am I? At the core of who I am, I'm a communicator. I own a public relations and community engagement firm here in Nashville, Tennessee, and I've owned that company for 12 years, where our real responsibility is to make sure that we provide inclusive communications, and we provide that lens for our organizations. Those are nonprofits, government, and businesses who are wanting to ensure that they're communicating most effectively. And so that is with individuals no matter their age, their ability, their ethnicity, their gender, orientation, or denomination. And that's a mouthful, but to be honest with you, very often we only think about our work as communicators in traditional media or social media. And so we want to go right to where our audience is. I'm also a culture shifter, and what that usually means is this very conversation is why I am usually approached, because what people are looking for is those small incremental shifts in their behavior, in their organization, or in their audience, so that they can do some things effectively without there being too much disruption or interruption to their business. And at the middle of who I am, which is why it sits in the middle, I'm an entrepreneur. And so I don't believe in business as usual. I'm usually very much so working with organizations to help them think much more entrepreneurially. As nonprofits, you are in business. And so helping you think about being more agile, innovative, disruptive in the approach that you have, really to ensure that we change the power dynamic of how we're spaced in our world. Right. So if you have you're an organization and your organization is primarily white male, then how is that really reflective, and what does that power dynamic look like to the constituents that you serve? How does that make them feel? That's really at the core of who I am, really that disruptor in that way as an entrepreneur. My nickname is Kiss with the Fist. I'm going to love on you, but it's going to be tough and hard, and it's going to be uncomfortable. And so I hope that you will join along with me. I also have the great privilege of being a Center for Nonprofit Management consultant, which is how I'm here today. And so I'm grateful always to be able to meet those of you on the other end of the screen in person at some point. I want to give you some community norms. What I hope to impart with this is really that you should, as you're beginning this conversation, you should really think about how you develop these norms within your own board. And so then they would be called community norms at that point, because you develop them as a community, and really setting that expectation that you're going to be preparing to have this conversation. So you're more than welcome to adopt some of these, or you can use some of your own that you all come up with together. I want you to know this is a safe space. This is a place where you can share things. You can ask what I call ignorant questions, things that sometimes you never get a chance to ask. Please ask them here, or even after I'm available to you. Become comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's really what this is all about. Ask for what you need in real time. So I have Don here with me. If you have a real-time question, something that in the moment I'm saying something and you want to say, oh my gosh, I need more help with that or understanding, please put your question in the question box. If it's something that can wait till the end, then she'll let me know, and we'll wait and hold that one until the end. I ask that you remain open-minded. Much of what this is disrupts the way that you normally think as either a nonprofit leader or as a board member or just a nonprofit in general. And so I want you to really remain open to the concept that there may not be a right or wrong. There may not be a best practice, but yet a best outcome. That's what I really want to maybe impart with you today. I want you to commit to go from talking to doing. This conversation is happening all across the country, as I mentioned earlier, which means that we're constantly in talk about it. When will we start doing? And so at a certain point, you've just got to just jump out there, even in its most uncomfortable way, and know that that's going to help you to know, oh, I made a mistake on that, or that didn't feel so comfortable, but it actually worked, or that wasn't so bad. And then take what you need, leave the rest on the floor. That just means everything I say today is not necessarily open for you to need to take back with you. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. I want you to take exactly what your organization needs and what your community, meaning your employees, your team needs, and you can leave the rest with me. All right, so what are the challenges with board diversity? I'm sure you know all too well. As you're listening to me, really think about what you think your own challenges are. And in a moment, when I get done talking, I'd love for you to even be able to place them in the question box for me so that I can just have some real-time data from you all. What I've learned is that because there is this comfort in business as usual and the way we've always done it, we have that syndrome really, really, really bad. It's always worked. Well, has it worked? And who has it worked for? And so we have to get out of this mindset of this is the way it always has been done, and this is the way we're going to continue to do it, particularly because what we also are realizing is that funders are okay with business as usual too sometimes. And so I'm working on that side as well to help them to think about how they turn that dynamic around. It's also challenging because no one wants to talk about the elephant in the room, race and ethnicity, gender and orientation, and most importantly, probably race and ethnicity. And that why? Because what it then does is it lets us know that we have to admit that there are systems of discrimination that have happened because of race, because of gender, because of orientation for many, many years. And we have to then hold the mirror up to say, have I been a part of that? Am I a part of the system? And then how do I dismantle some of that? We then also have challenges because we're more concerned sometimes with recruiting than building real relationships and making sure that that when we go from results, we're looking to go from to result immediately versus all the activities that have the potential to happen. What happens when you really build a relationship with someone? Then you, over time, take the time. This is not, board diversity is not the only area in which that is of concern. Community engagement is the same way. We want to usually go into communities and then fix something versus listening versus learning. Then we're able to then adapt very much so to the concerns of that particular culture, ethnicity, community in ways that are so much different once we have a relationship with them. And then I've also learned that it's really hard, very similar to the first one. That's the reason why it's kind of the bookend. It's hard to shift the culture. We are sometimes really unwilling to just make small adjustments. Sometimes that's technology, but sometimes it's also language. How do we talk about the communities in which we work with? I'll give you a quick example. I was in a meeting yesterday. We were talking about the conversation or the language of them versus we. And so when it's the othering, and that's what that really is, like all of those other people over there, that's who we serve. It'll never happen to me. It's never me. It's never us. It's never we. When that's the case, then we never get a chance to really see that we can shift. We could really be instrumental in shifting the way that we talk about that. If that language is not going to be adapted or adaptable, then we'll never be able to shift that culture. And so that's one of the ways in which I see being a big challenge. Last challenge that I see, this is just my own anecdote, which is, as I mentioned earlier, if you already have exhausting board members, so they've been there for a long time, that's already challenging, adding a whole new dynamic of working in being in relationship with other people is a challenge. You can't even wrap your mind around it, and so that's also why we have these challenges. Are there any questions in our question box or any challenges that you all may have that you'd like to share? I'd love to hear those. So I put this picture here. They always say kids and animals are always a thing that get your attention, but I really would love to know what your challenges are. And so this dog, though that's the actual face of a pug all the time, it also looks a little bit distressed and challenged. And so I would love to know what those challenges are. So you can share them throughout the presentation with me in that question box so that I can have real-time data on what is challenging some of our local organizations. So what does diversity really look like? So I pulled this diversity wheel from Johns Hopkins. You can find diversity wheel of a magnitude of colors online, so you can do a quick search, but I've given you the link there, and I'm happy to make sure that you have that link in a clickable format. So there's multiple layers. We're just like onions, right? That we have all of these layers to who we are. And the internal, what you'll see, the race, ethnicity, age, gender, origin, orientation, ability, those are physical attributes that we know of people. And so those are things that we can outwardly see of them. But then there's this external area, and we call that very often diversity of thought. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But what I want to make sure is that you're also mindful of faith organizations or religious backgrounds, income, language, not just language that a native to the country that they come from, but also how they communicate, being very comfortable with people who communicate in much different ways than you do. Age, thinking about not just putting people into, oh, those millennials, oh, those boomers, but really being mindful and thoughtful about that. One thing I'll pause here and say is that in general, one of the questions that I get, and I'll go ahead and jump to, is about tokenizing. Very often people say, how do we make sure we do this work without making other people feel like they're the token? And the way that that works is in relationship to what I'm talking about and what I'll continue to give you as potential solutions for your organization. But also, one of the ways to do that is to know that no one is monolithic, right? No community is a monolith. And what that really means is that we have to stop thinking about, I'm going to have place a person on this board and they're going to be representative of an entire community of people. That's not how this works. How it really works is that you will get a different perspective that might be representative of that community, which is going to be very helpful. But what is not going to be helpful is if they then have to feel the weight of always speaking on behalf of, or always in the same vein, always been speaking in relationship to something that's challenging that's happening. Always having to speak up on your own behalf to say, you know, that doesn't feel comfortable, or I don't like that we did that. That's also very challenging for people who are sitting on your boards who are from diverse communities. They don't always want to be the one who has to talk about those challenging moments. So we all have to be accountable to that. And why does it really matter? So it's good for business. I was in research, as I was sharing with Don earlier, that I'm always in constant research of these topics because I want to make sure that nothing has come up that I'm unfamiliar with that I can't share with you in real time so that you're most informed. And so on one side, you're going to have these articles that talk about, if you Google business case for diversity, you're going to have people who are saying this is so important to how we do business. The numbers are there, the data is there. On the other side, you're going to have diversity and inclusion experts across the country who say this is foolish, that we're even having to make this case. It's not because they think that it's not good for business. It's just that why do we have to talk about that it's good for business? Because it can't just be about the numbers. It's not just about the census data. It's not just about the poverty line. It's not just about those that we serve. It's also that being good for business also is that we're good community members, we're good neighbors, that we are thoughtful about the mission that we're here to set out, that we're going forward to the vision of an organization. Those are also good and important ways to do business, not just the bottom line, the dollar amount. Next, it connects with your board and its true mission. And so when you think about this particular bullet, think about your constituents and those you serve. They are really your mission, right? And so if you connect them to being on a board, being on your board, then they get an opportunity to really live out and show and be a display of what your mission really is fulfilled. Next is that you get a full spectrum of fresh perspective. So I don't know about you, but I like to sit around people who are all different and varied from me, whether it be because we are from different communities, whether it be because I have a child and they don't, whether it be because I went to school, college, and they did not. I want a full spectrum of fresh perspective because what it does is it then challenges the very behavior that we sometimes run into in these situations where maybe there's something that happens on social media as an example. And I share that example because that's sometimes what happens is that a post goes up and it's the language may not be appropriate or the teacher may not have felt as comfortable. And so you get a chance to have a spectrum of perspectives that you never heard of and you never even thought of. I'll give you a quick example of that. I was working with an organization and they were working with a senior individual as a participant in their program. And she mentioned, the executive director said, well, Carolyn, and she went on to say whatever her point was. And I said, well, I want to just help you understand that maybe we should call her Miss and whatever her last name is, because the respect in certain communities has to be there. And I think in all communities, right? But there are some communities that we really double down on making sure that respect and hierarchy is very important. You have to know that, and you only get that from those perspectives. It assesses those blind spots. One of the things we were just talking about in my office recently was I was talking with someone, and she said, I have a challenge sometimes seeing the periphery. And how many of us who've been doing this work for so long have a challenge really seeing the true peripheral of what's happening in the world, but also in our organization. We believe that everything is going well, and it might actually be going well according to how business usually goes, but it may not be going well according to how the world is going. And so assessing those blind spots, again, it goes back to that full spectrum. It really allows you to then see things that you've never seen before. It also serves as a reflection of our world. If you look at your constituency, and I go back to those numbers, and I look and see who you represent and who you work with, and then who's on your board, I'm very challenged to see that there's not that reflection there. The other nugget I'll give you, which is over in your little pop-out bubble there, talks about if we really have diverse perspectives, we might actually cure the mission of why we're actually in business. And so what that really means, and that's a stinger for some organizations when I say that, what that really means is those diverse perspectives help us to actually move past the original mission, and we might actually move towards another mission because we've actually solved the problem that we were started for in the beginning. So don't forget about inclusion in this conversation. Very often we're talking about just diversity. And my definition of diversity is really that acknowledgement that we have varying backgrounds, and that's great. But acknowledgement alone is not enough. Inclusion is really what we're aiming towards, which is that specific and written program or policy that helps the relationship become cemented so that I know that I'm a valued and strong contributor to your organization. So what that means is, do you have a board policy that really specifically talks about how you do business? So the example is you buy pens and you might buy trash can liners. So supplier diversity is an example of that. Do you have a policy specifically to that? So make sure that it's not just that you're talking about diversity, but that you also are inclusive. I want to also make sure that you don't fall into diversity of thought trap. So yes, I mentioned earlier, it's a real live thing, that diversity of thought, which means that we come all from different perspectives. But where this is showing up and how this is being harmful is that we're using this to only work with communities that we feel comfortable with. So we're increasing our pipeline of female leaders. But are we increasing the pipeline of African American or Latino or Kurdish leaders? We are increasing the pipeline maybe of individuals who are gay, but we're not necessarily increasing the pipeline of leadership from those from different faith backgrounds than us. And so we really have to make sure we're not just in the diversity of thought trap, but that we're really being thoughtful about, do we have, again, the full spectrum of perspectives. So how do we recruit a diverse board in a way that isn't tokenizing? I want you to think of skill first. So the question I have here comes from, do we have a matrix, do you have a board matrix that helps you to know what skills you need on your board? Because it's, again, not enough to just have a person who is of a specific background. It is to make sure that you actually are meeting the mission. So do you have that person who's skilled? If you don't have that matrix, you should have it. I want you to think about, I think about boards, just like I think about business, there needs to be four particular people, and then you can add from there based on your particular kind of genre industry. So you need HR, so someone working on the human capital. You need someone thinking about accounting or the numbers, a treasurer or something to that sort. You need someone thinking about communications or marketing, and you need someone thinking about legal. How do you stay out of trouble? And that's usually in the governance space. And so those are the four areas I know at least we have to have. And then you can add on to there based on who is in the client community, and are there individuals who are in social services or social work or healthcare or all of these other areas in which we know that we cover. Do they have a passion for the mission? Again, it goes back to the skills. I want you to have a skill, but I want you to have a passion. I don't want to just plop you in, making sure that that person is actually someone who can be an investment into the organization and not just an opportunity for you to say, see, we have a person who is of certain background. I want you to develop a pipeline for exposure to the organization. Again, that goes back to activity versus immediate results. So do you have a way in which sororities and fraternities can come in and just learn more about your space? Do you have mission moment exercises or lunch and learns? Those can happen almost with limited amounts of funds. So meaning people can bring brown bag lunches to a quick lunch and learn more about the organization, hear from someone actually participating in the organization. And let me just tell you, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but representation is so important. Because if you have people who are in that pipeline, I then, as a person who may be going through your program, now feel like you have an additional investment into me as a person. So not just that you care about the service for me, but that you also care about the background and investment of who I am as a person. So think about how you can get them into volunteering. Think about how you can get them into other philanthropic areas. Think about, is there a young professional auxiliary group? Is there a board of advisors versus a board of directors where they can participate quarterly versus monthly or bi-monthly? Think about other opportunities for exposure. I want you to think about developing an organizational and board program and or policy. This really goes to the heart of your strategic planning. What often happens is that organizations do strategic planning and then they call me and say, okay, now we want to create our policy around diversity and inclusion and equity. And I say, no, wait a minute, why didn't we participate in the strategic planning process? because it should be one and the same, embedded in, not aligned with. And so I'll say that again, embedded in, not aligned with. We don't want to sit beside the planning process. We want to sit within the planning process. So developing that organizational and board program and or policy that really speaks to that. Language matters. One of the things that I have learned doing this work, of course, that language matters. So one piece of that is that we talk people first. I'm sure that you all may have some similar language. And so what that may mean is that we work with individuals experiencing domestic violence. We work with organizations, we work with people or individuals experiencing homelessness, experiencing abuse. That way, the person is not the situation. Okay, that people first language matters. It also matters in the way that we have job descriptions, board descriptions, and other language. One of the things I was talking to a colleague recently about who was recruiting Latino families to volunteer their time at a local, a clothing bank where they were sorting clothes to give out to the community. And that language of volunteerism, and we've heard it a couple of times, that language is a natural part of several communities, and so when they hear that, it doesn't incline them to then do the work. They say, okay, I'm already volunteering, I'm already spending time in my faith organization, I'm already doing some of this volunteer work. What do you mean? So think about that. Is that language itself hurtful or harmful to your descriptions that you have out there? The same with technology. Are you talking about technology in a way, or are you using language that is not for commonly used within for females or for African Americans? Or you can go and do that research through focus groups, but that language is so important for that reason. I want you to think about breaking down those systems of inequity. What I mean is, how many of you have board meetings in the middle of the day? And so in several organizations, right? I'm on a board now where we meet one day. We meet twice a month, and so we meet once during the day and once in the evening. And so there's an opportunity there for you to figure out, can you rotate meetings? Can you go from a weeknight to a weekend day? How do we really think about being more equitable? Is it that you need to serve dinner or provide some type of child care service? Again, the goal of this is not to put you out of business, by doing this. The goal is to also go think about the systems that you already have in place that may not be as friendly or helpful for you as you're in this recruitment process. I've already talked about representation matters. It really does. People are able to be what they can see. And so if you want me to be a donor, then I need to see someone as a reflection of your work that looks something like me. That does not mean that I'm talking only about the external. It means that when I look at a magazine, as an example, I scroll through every page, or I flip through every page and look at the pictures, because I'm looking for that representation of someone who looks like me. And that means mother, that means entrepreneur, that means I'm 5'1", and so I'm looking for someone who fits into that. It means I'm looking for someone who maybe is college educated, or I'm looking for someone who's a Girl Scout, as I'm a lifetime member. I'm looking for something that fits. I'm looking for someone who's African American. So you see how many things I got to before I even got to race. That's what we have to make sure that is there some representation that I can see that I can subscribe to. Trust is also a metric. I know that very often in nonprofit work, we are very output driven, and so many of you are working towards outcome driven, and I think that's amazing. We also have to look at how we go beyond numbers and beyond the quantity of something and really the quality of it. And so trust is also a metric. Did you build trust in a community based on when you built a relationship with them? Because that's also a place where that is so invaluable. That's almost something you can never put a number or a price on, because that trust, and then when it goes the opposite way, when you lost the trust, it also can be negatively impactful. So also know that the metrics that you are looking at, the data that you're looking at, has to be more than just numbers, because we can use numbers to weaponize. Data can be very weaponizing, particularly in communities of color, particularly of communities that are vulnerable or underserviced. And so we have to make sure that we're also using other metrics. And I want you to think about how you leverage your privilege. I talk about this almost ad nauseum every single day, almost, and we all have a privilege. Every single person does. It's just a matter of how you tap into it, but some of us have way more. And so how do we turn power and resource on its head to ensure that we are able to use that privilege on someone else's behalf so that we can push equity for them, so they feel like they are welcome, and they're able to be successful and thrive and not just be given a seat at the table, which is also sometimes a challenge and can be tokenizing. So here are some potential next steps. I mean, there are tons of things that you all can do, and I'm happy to address those in just a moment. I want to make sure that I think that I'm getting so close to my time, or I have gone over, so I'm so grateful for you staying with me. I want you to think about updating your strategic plan. This is now the time to really look at that and align your diversity and inclusion goals with that plan so that you can really be mindful. If you have a fundraising goal, how will you then assign and assess some of that to communities that you want to work with that are very different than you've ever communicated with? I want you to develop organizational and board diversity and inclusion policy language. Really being mindful of that. That might mean that you need to create a diversity and inclusion board committee that specifically works on that, and you can do this for 6 months, 8 months. This is not something you do overnight. I'm not even encouraging that you think about the immediate results of this. I want you to go through a process, and you will know what that process looks like once you get into it a little bit more. Begin developing relationships with diverse communities. This could be as simple as joining some groups on social media. This could be as simple as you going and asking someone who you have current relationship with some of these hard-pressing questions that you have. How can I build a relationship in these communities? And that person can then talk to you and talk you through that process kind of in your own kind of focus group. I want you to think about developing an employee and volunteer recruitment plan that really looks at updated language and your outreach strategy. Again, this could be as simple as really being able to, we'll get it resumed in just a moment, but I'll continue to talk through that outreach strategy. Could be as simple as going to visit a church on a Sunday, not asking any questions, but just listening. Going to visit a mosque, knowing and understanding the cultural dynamic of that. Went to a mosque working on a campaign a few years ago, and it was supposed to be the women and the men were going to be there with the children. And it just so happened it was a holiday weekend, and so the women weren't there. And so I was there with 2 male colleagues, and I knew that my role then needed to change because I no longer needed to have the same relationship in that community that I had previous to that. So I added things as I only needed to. I spoke to the gentleman that I was there and allowed them to share information on my behalf because I respect that the outreach strategy had to be much different in that environment. And then I want you to look at messaging and visuals and things that you have out in the atmosphere once you've done the actual work. I don't want you to change them until you've actually done them and they're representative. But it's really making sure that you have a full spectrum of people that when I go looking as someone looking to orient on your board or be a volunteer or be a donor, that I then see visuals or messaging that really feels like something I could be comfortable with. I won't go through all of this just for time's sake, but I want you to think about, I want you to think about the assessment that you all can do. And I gave just a couple of questions here to think about, but you could very simply, and I'm happy to send some resources afterwards as well, but I found so many assessment tools online as I was in development just to make sure that I was seeing some of the newer things that are happening and that are out there. You could Google culturally adept assessments. You can look at cultural sensitivities, which we know that language is not always most up to date, but there's still some things out there that could be helpful. So here's a couple of those questions I came up with. Are representatives of your community on your team? And so when this work happens, I very often then say, okay, well, let's not just look at the board. We've got to look even more internal than that, because the board kind of comes and goes, and although staff does as well, that there's got to be a real culture within the organization that diversity is important. And so what does the team look like? And then we begin to look at, are there representatives on the community from that board, on your board? And how that could happen is your local university, if you give them the skills that you're looking for, and then you give and build the relationship, then there are certain departments that will send you that diverse community member, without it even being that you've asked for that, but just because of you have the right skill matrix that I talked about a little bit earlier that can ask for those board members in that way. So do you have representatives from the community and on the community that you serve on your board? Do you have a board policy dedicated to diversity and inclusion? And then the next question really is, how are you living that out? Because we can all have those things written, we can all have those visuals, but how are we really actually living them out? Do you have a diversity committee? This might be an opportunity because they can then help you to assess, look at those blind spots, and then they'll create their own assessment of when you all make big strategic initiatives happen, or when you're talking about them in the planning process, they can really say, well, let's go through our assessment tool, not just to check the boxes, but really to be mindful of if this is something that we should be doing and how inclusive we can be when we deliver it to our community. Do you have systems, policies, and programs that might be discriminatory? You really have to look at that. So what that might mean, I'll give you an example that I don't think was on our spectrum. Technology is the only way you communicate with your board through email. Is the only way you communicate through writing. Is there a way that I can call in and get the message or to get the note? Again, not trying to create so many things that are costly to you, but really just in your process of thinking, I want you to go deeper than kind of the surface. And so that example gives you some of that. And do you train your team on how to really be culturally adept? What type of training processes do you have in place? What happens when you onboard new staff members? What happens when you onboard new board members? What's the language that you're using when volunteers come on board? How do they know that you're not just talking about it, but actually participating in it and being a part of it? Particularly working in this particular sector, you're working with sensitivities all the way around. And so we also have to then be mindful of how this shows up, not just in a race or ethnicity, but also just the full spectrum of how someone can be very different from us. And then keeping an open mind to know that because they're not the same as us does not mean that they're any less than us or any less valuable than us in the process. So going through that training helps with that in particular. And so that's kind of it. I've given several tools and things and resources, and I always have lots more, so I'm happy to share them as questions come in. And I'm opening the lines up now. I'd love to have questions if there are some. So please put them over in the question box so that we can chat, or I can answer something, or if you just want me to know that what your challenges are so that I can be mindful of those as I'm preparing resources to send back to you all if necessary. So I hope that this was helpful for you as you think about how to really build relationships and not just get to the end result of the relationship that you're trying to build so quickly, but really figure out how that spectrum works for your organization. You know, what's the pipeline of moving people through to get to mission and not just to results. So are there any questions that you all may have of me, or any other slides you want to kind of double click on and go back to and talk through?
Just one of the challenges that someone posed was more time in general to prioritize things. Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I think that that's certainly a great point of how do we find more time. And very often, again, I think in the beginning, my superpower is perspective. And so when we think about it from the time perspective, we'll never have enough of it. So I encourage you to just shift that from how do I break down my time to really prioritize that. Again, very, very, very small shift in how you think about that. Because when we talk about thinking about time, then we're always almost always out of it. By the time we thought about it, it's over. So take one of those bullets that I gave about solutions potentially, and literally for the whole year, break down that one solution over the course of the year. And it might be that looks like that you put together a committee for your board, diversity and inclusion committee, and they continue to listen and bring back feedback and listen and bring back feedback. One of the things I was thinking about on the drive over, it might be an easy, really simple, easy solution, is to get your culture, because I think somebody else has a question about kind of how we shift the inclusion model. One suggestion might be how we shift in general, just our culture, is that diversity and inclusion committee could then bring one challenging question every board meeting that you all then have to talk about. So you can give a time limit to it. We're going to talk about this for 15 minutes. Here's the hard question we need to think about. 15 minutes of conversation, let's do it. You dig in, you talk about it. It's not to get an answer right or wrong. It's not to get even a solution immediately. It's really just to get the wheels turning on having the conversation. Because the hardest part of this is that it's really, really, really uncomfortable
to have the conversation. So I would suggest that 5 to 15 minutes each board meeting really dedicated to a mission moment on the, on one end, and then you might have a middle of the meeting or towards the end having that really hard pressing question that's challenging to you and challenging to the board, but then adopts a culture of challenging each other and not just groupthink. I think I see another question here. Do I have an example of an organization that has really accomplished the shift to inclusion in a model way? I don't have one off the top of my head, so it's a great question that has done it in a great way. There are some larger organizations, corporate, that I can think of that have done that in a really great way. But as it relates to nonprofit, I haven't seen that. However, what I will do, I'll take that question back and I'll really sit with it and see if I can find some. There are organizations, I think, doing really great work. I believe what happens, where some of the breakdown happens, is that how much control are we willing to give up in this process, and how much are we willing to provide really an equitable experience for people. So that goes even further, where we really talk about that there are certain communities who never have been at ground zero in their ability to even accomplish the goals of life, right? Again, going back to systems of discrimination and of injustice. And so if we really acknowledge that, then it begins to beg the question, what are we willing to give up? And sometimes it's power. Because that's really what you're talking about here is a shift. When you talk about shift in inclusion, you're talking about a shift in power, a shift in resources, so assigning resources to organizations or to people, to individuals or communities who are very often left out of the equation in big ways. And that's really the piece I haven't seen done as well. But I will look into that. Great question. Thank you so much. Any other questions, burning questions that you might have? And no pressure. I always say it's challenging to ask the questions in real time and in front of everyone. And so I'm also happy to answer questions through email. Don can help field those for me, and we can put those, put some pen to paper, and I can get some answers back over to you.
Okay,
do that.
Great.
All right. Thank you all so much. I'm so grateful for the time that we had together. I do hope that you will take some things back and implement them in real time, even if it's the smallest of gesture. That one small incremental shift will make a massive impact in the end, because you'll continue to do those shifts over time. So I'm so grateful for your time. Find me online. I'm at Kia Jarmon at all the social sites, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And then you can also email me as well, and I'm more than happy to serve and support in that way as well.
Thank you, Kia.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you.